Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of Pick of the Pack on Gran Turismo 6 in particular. And for those who are perhaps new to this series, what we do is we go through the cliche of Gran Turismo, the number one cliche, and that is the needless duplicates of certain cars. The Skyline tends to be the one that everyone goes to, then probably the MX-5. Those are the two with arguably the most needless ones. But they're not the only culprits. There are definitely others as well. Stuff like the RX-7, or this one, the Mitsubishi 3000 GT, aka the GTO, depending of course on the market, the version, etc. Now this car has a lot of variations, spanning 3 model years, 1995, 96, and then 98. There are no racing versions on Gran Turismo 6. There did used to be on GT1 and GT2, I think primarily GT1. The 3000 GT racing version was, if I remember correctly, one of the best race cars in the game, so it's kind of a shame that we don't still have that. We do of course have the fictional FTO Super Touring car, which is very popular, but still, how cool would it be to still have a full-on, say 600 horsepower GTO based race car? But still. So, as always, we're going to break down each model year and discuss all of the variations within it, list out all the specs on screen, so that for those who are fans of the car you can actually narrow it down to which ones are worth buying and which ones are just entirely unnecessary. So, let's get straight into it with 1995. First up then, in 1995, there are 7 distinct versions. Now 3 of those are naturally aspirated. Both of the SRs and the SL are all naturally aspirated models, and as you can see, the result of that is that they have far less power, less than half the power in fact, around a third of the torque, or not far off, but they are also a lot lighter. So it's not a weak car by any means, they're also cheaper, and in fact the 3 naturally aspirated models from this year are in fact the cheapest of them all. Now with that in mind, even though they are the cheapest, they're not the cheapest by much. The naturally aspirated models from 96 and 98 also cost just under 30 grand, so it really is just chump change between the 3 of them. But these are, technically speaking, the cheapest GTOs of them all. So that's something to bear in mind. Plus, for this particular model year, all 3 of the naturally aspirated models are the lightest, at 1289 kilos, far lighter than any of the turbo models of 1995. However, when it comes to power and torque, of course, and straight line performance, in particular top end, of course, the twin turbos are the superior cars. They cost more, 39 grand and 43 grand respectively, 2 for either. The PP level, the power level, the torque does vary quite a bit though, and interestingly, very interestingly, both of the MR models from this year, the ones that cost 39 grand, actually have, alongside 2 of the 1998 MR models, the highest torque of all of the GTOs and the 3000 GTs, 951 pound-feet. That is a massive amount of torque. In fact, it's up there with the Supra in terms of just how massive it is. Now, the horsepower per tonne on the MR models is actually the same as the VR4 for this year as well, just under 700 horsepower per tonne, even though the VR4 is heavier at 1370 kilos to the 1345 of the MR versions. Now, overall, for this particular year, I would say that the standout is probably the MR. Because at the same time as being inferior in some ways to the twin turbo or the VR4, the MR versions do have some significant advantages. The PP level is higher when fully tuned, giving you more range of potential. They are also cheaper. The horsepower isn't quite as high, but 936 isn't exactly lacking. The torque is higher, a lot higher than the twin turbo version in fact. The weight is also lower than those twin turbo and VR4 versions, and consequently, as I said, the horsepower per tonne is among the best of this year. However, and we'll get into this more in a second, but to be completely honest, I don't feel that any of this generation is particularly necessary. If I was only going to recommend one, I would actually recommend the very top, the GTO SR, because it's just the absolute basic, back to basics, simple, bog standard version. dirt cheap price, no fancy name, just does what it says on the tin. Naturally aspirated, 410 horsepower, lightweight, just keeps it simple. That is, of course, if you want the naturally aspirated model, and that's the one that you can see in this video. It's still a great handling car, you've still got all-wheel drive, and I even still did a top speed tune for it. It's not a slow car either. Of course, it's nowhere near as quick, but still. What then about 1996? Well, for 1996, in a similar way to some of the other episodes in this series, it follows a very similar formula. You've also got naturally aspirated and turbo models, although interestingly for this year, you've got 5 versions instead of 7, and more of them in comparison are naturally aspirated than turbo. There are 3 naturally aspirated versions still, just like the previous year, but instead of having 4 turbo cars, this year there's only 2. The twin turbo and the VR4. Now overall, they actually have exactly the same numbers. All of the naturally aspirated cars from this year have the same numbers, and both of the turbo versions, even as far as price, are exactly the same as each other. Now overall for this year, I would recommend getting one of the turbo versions, probably the VR4, let's just say. But overall, I have to once again say, unless you are specifically looking for a pre-facelift 3000 GT or GTO, this model year, 1996, to be honest, in its entirety just does not feel necessary. All 5 of these cars are not bad, but at the same time the improvements which are there just aren't significant enough. The naturally aspirated versions, the SRs and the SL in particular, they are technically superior to the 95 versions, but only in terms of PP level. They are 2 points higher. But apart from that, there's no advantage. They cost a little bit more. The power, torque, weight, and horsepower per ton are all the same anyway. And even the turbo versions, the twin turbo and the VR4, are not quite as good as the previous year. In fact, the PP level, the power, the torque, the weight, and the horsepower per ton are all inferior compared to the 1995 versions, in particular the MR versions. So overall, considering that this is the last of the first generation visual version of the GTO before the facelift, if you are going to get one, I would actually recommend just going for the 1995 GTO MR or the 3000 GT MR. So just the MRs, basically. There are only 2, so just pick which name you want. From 1995, they're the best overall. As far as the turbo ones, that is. As far as the naturally aspirated ones, well, take your pick. They're much of a muchness. But overall, that is it for the first generation visual version of the GTO. What then about the facelift in 1998? Well, now for 1998, as I alluded to just now, you do get a facelift. And in particular from the front end, the car does look significantly different. I personally think it's a better looking car for this model year, but of course that's down to personal preference. And for this year, we get even more variations than either of the 2 years. We had 7, then 5, and now we've got 8 different cars for this particular year. Now, you get 3 naturally aspirated models once again, the SR, in fact 2 versions of the SR and the SL, and once again, slight price increase and a slight PP increase, but thankfully there is a difference apart from that, and that is that the weight has dropped. In fact, it's dropped enough to make all 3 of these naturally aspirated versions, the SR, the 3000 GT SL and the 3000 GT SR, the lightest of them all. 1281 kilos is the lightest of all of the models from all 3 years. So that's good to bear in mind, and consequently the horsepower per ton is a little bit higher than all of the other naturally aspirated cars. Which is basically why I said that if you want a naturally aspirated model, you are better off getting one of these. Because apart from the price, which is still only 70 credits more, not exactly breaking the bank, it's just the better version. So if you want one of the naturally aspirated cars, go for one of these. That's what I'd recommend. Unless, of course, you specifically like the older appearance, but of course that's down to you. As far as the turbo ones go, well, this is where it gets interesting, because you've got the GTO twin turbo, then you've got the twin turbo MR, you've got the VR4, in VR4 Turbo and technically VR4, which is still a turbo form. Not sure why they did that, but there are two anyway. And the 3000 GT MR, along with the GTO MR. So you've got two VR4s, two MRs, and a twin turbo. It's getting needlessly complex here, guys. Why do we need this many? Of course, that's the whole point of this series, but still, there are certain cars which really do drive the point home. We don't need this many. So with that in mind, this particular year, the VR4s, standing out above all others, actually have the most power. 958 horsepower is the highest of them all. Both of the VR4s from this year have that. As far as torque, as I mentioned earlier on, way back in 1995, 951 pound-feet from both of the MR versions is, alongside the MRs from 95, the highest, 951. However, the great thing about these MRs is that they have huge power, huge torque, in particular torque. The power hasn't jumped by much, but the weight is lower. Not by a huge amount, but still, 1,337 kilos means that these two MR versions are actually the lightest of all of the turbocharged versions. So, as I said, unless you specifically prefer the look of the 95 or 96 shaped cars, there really is no reason to buy them, because the 98 cars in both naturally aspirated and turbo forms are just better across the board. In fact, apart from price, which is a really significant advantage really, given that it's only 70 credits less, there is no advantage to any of the older ones. Even the torque figure of the 95 MR is matched by these MRs from 98 anyway. So overall, as far as which cars dominate what, the 1995 naturally aspirated cars are, in all three of the naturally aspirated forms, the cheapest of them all, but as we said, not by much. Then, for engine size, they are literally all exactly the same, down to the cc, so that's irrelevant. As far as PP level, the 1998 MR versions are the best at 635, which is the highest potential. As far as horsepower, it's the 98 VR4s with 958 horsepower. As far as torque, it's also, like with the PP level, the 1998 MR versions with 951, but that does also share that with the 95 MRs, but again, it's irrelevant really. As far as weight, it's the 1998 naturally aspirated versions at 1,281 kilos, and finally for the horsepower per ton, it's once again the VR4s from 1998. So if you're only going to buy one or maybe two, say for instance you want one with the turbo or the twin turbo and one with naturally aspirated layouts, I'd actually recommend just sticking to 1998 for both, because they are better overall. If you like the older looking versions, then of course take your pick. But if you're purely looking for the best ones and you don't care, say you're not an aficionado or a super fan, then I would say take your pick of any of the naturally aspirated 98 cars, which is the GTO SR, the 3000 GT SL, or the 3000 GT SR. They're all much of a muchness, so pick whichever one you like. And if you're looking for a turbo aspirated version, I would recommend getting the 98 MR, either of them. They're both equal across the board. Personally, I prefer the GTO Twin Turbo MR, but I just prefer the name. So that's the only real difference. Overall then, there are way too many. There are far too many of these on the game, and the vast majority of them are totally pointless. I'm sure there are people who love having this many, but most of us couldn't care less. So overall, that is it for which ones I would recommend buying and which ones are just entirely unnecessary. And the strangest thing of all to me is that with all of these versions in the game, we still don't have a single premium one. That is so strange to me. But that's the way it is. I do feel that this does have a pretty decent chance of returning to Gran Turismo, and also if either the GTO or the 3000 GT does return to the Gran Turismo franchise in GT Sport as a DLC car, that would be interesting to see, because it will be the first time we've ever had a premium version of this car. So if you are a fan, that's something to think about and potentially look forward to. But that's it overall for this particular pick of the pack. Of course, I'll see you guys again next week, probably for the R34 Skyline, and then that'll be all of the Skylines dealt with for this series. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.